So we are live now. Good evening, everyone. I am
Good
Soumi
evening.
Bandyopadhyay, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology curated under TMYS review in association with Center of South Asian Studies, University of Hawaii. Under this theme, TMYS review March 2023 will explore the role of community appearance and individual presentation in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I would also like to say that we are calling for submission of stories, essays, and poems, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstories.biz. Today's topic of discussion is preserving the repository of indigenous culture and religion, the untold stories, celebrating and promoting the indigenous culture. We are honored to have with us Dr. Ananya Gupta, Dr. Shib Majumder. Thank you so much for joining us. And I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for tonight is Dr. Ananya Gupta. And Dr. Ananya Gupta has taught Vishwabharati University for nearly 2 decades. She secured an MPhil degree in early modern English literature as a postgraduate Felix Scholar at Oxford University. Her revised Orient Black Swan annotated edition of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, Book 1, which was published in 2012, continues to be in worldwide circulation, and she has several other scholarly articles published in national and international journals to her credit. She was Charles Wallace India Trust Visiting Fellow at the Center for Research in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Cambridge in 2015. She has delivered invited talks and presented several other academic papers in the past 2 years, notably at the World Shakespeare Congress, Singapore 2021. Next, we have Dr. Shib Majumder. Dr. Shib Majumder is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Assam University, Silchar. He was awarded a PhD degree by Guwahati University in 2016. He specializes in drama, theatre, and performance studies, literature in English from India's northeast, partition and issues of migration in eastern India, etc. He was published research articles in various reputed journals enlisted with UGC and Care List, and also chapters in edited books published by national and international publishers. We have also Dr. Anway Mukhopadhyay. Dr. Anway Mukhopadhyay is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Kharagpur. He has authored 5 academic books, a lyric epic and an innovative work of fiction, and has co-edited an anthology of essays on fiction studies. He has contributed chapters to several edited volumes, and his research papers, book review, and creative writing have been published in reputed journals in India, Australia, and USA. His documentary film on women's Sanskritic education in Varanasi, titled Daughters of Saraswati, is available on YouTube. Recipient of a number of awards, including the prestigious Indira Gandhi Priyadarshini Award, conferred by the IBC in 2016, Dr. Mukhopadhyay is also an associate faculty at the Center for Advanced Studies in South Asia, Lalitpur, Nepal. And our uh, final panelist, Prem Phyak, who is still absent. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Now, without further delay, we shall start with today's session. First, I would like to request Dr. Ananya Gupta to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
So kind of you, such a generous introduction, and such an honor to be on this panel. A very exciting project, and so kudos to Dr. Dash Gupta and her associates. I'm a total outsider to the core, if you like, subject of this panel, because I'm not an Indologist or if you are an archaeologist or an ethnologist. I don't fit any of these bills. I'm an outsider. But what I can perhaps try and bring to the table is my experience as a reader of text. So I'd like to begin by maybe nitpick the word indigenous and see what it might yield and how it might in many ways be problematized. Um, I was looking it up, not that I went deeper into its etymological roots, but at a very ground level, if you like, it means something that is of a particular place, original to it. So, but I when I started kind of thinking around that, the idea of originality, what it seems to bring together is a sense of both of place and a sense of time. Indigenous is a concept that you kind of arrive at retrospectively. The indigenous doesn't see itself as indigenous; it sees itself, well, as just as it is, as it were, almost as endogenous. But indigenous kind of is a label, is a category that can only be arrived at by contrast in, or as in something that stands in opposition to what comes after it. So there's a kind of, what I see is a certain kind of diachronic circularity to the idea of the indigenous. The indigenous um, is what is defined by its successor. So that's kind of the time frame. But when we talk indigenous culture, indigenous customs and rights, and of course the idea of the indigenous community, we are also talking in terms of a place. There's a particularity to it, which is probably geographical. So I think it's fascinating to think of indigenous as a cusp of a place, something specific to a place, which has also survived, shall we say, centuries of change, or maybe which has to be excavated, realized, rediscovered through the layers that have succeeded it. So I thought this was something that really kind of intrigued and interested me as in terms of what we may do philologically with the idea, and what this might actually lead to. And then I kind of went on to think in terms of another word that this term has yielded, which is indigenization, and see what it in what kind of a relationship it places itself vis-a-vis the term indigenous. I think what happens is a certain kind of, shall we say, what emerges is a certain conflict, if you like. Um, if indigenous is something that relates to the idea of a home, peculiar to a time or a place, indigenization, of course, seems to suggest something that can be brought over, carried over. So it is in many ways the precise opposite of what the indigenous suggests. What can be indigenized is clearly what lies outside, beyond, either in terms of time, in terms of the past, or in terms of somewhere, some place elsewhere, which can be brought home. So the homegrown and what can be, as it were, domiciled consciously, there's somewhere is a tension. I certainly see a kind of tension between the two terms, and I would like to kind of hear my fellow panelists perhaps responses to the possibilities in the term itself, and the tensions, as I said, in the term. But as a reader of texts, if you like, for me, the indigenous is, and the questions that I kind of we were Ms. Bandyopadhyay, we were discussing in the lead up to this panel discussion, are as a reader of text, as I said, my only kind of my preferred avenue to enter into this discourse will have to be somewhere, perhaps literary texts, and the long and very rich history of engagement with the notion of indigeneity there. And here, I mean, there are other ways, so many ways of going about it. But to me, a very contemporary writer who seems to have a central place in what we are discussing today would be Amitav Ghosh, and particularly the two texts, two books, fascinatingly kind of new writing as far as what we know Amitav Ghosh by, his earlier works, Living Mountain and Jungle Nama, to be precise, and also as a kind of parallel text, something that he does in a different vein, but with distinct kind of thematic and discursive overlaps, nutmeg's curse. So if we are talking in terms of indigeneity as a way of life, as a way of life that cannot be reduced to what we conventionally take to be a kind of a monologic understanding of knowledge, which is usually seen to be of Western origin, and particularly something that is traced back to the Enlightenment and its legacy, then the indigenous way of life somewhere, particularly in the way Amitav Ghosh seems to have revived, retrieved, resurrected it, is of utmost consequence at a time when the world needs to come together to and brace itself for the extraordinary challenge that climate change poses. So, in the Living Mountain, which is a kind of wonderful, kind of, if you like, sparse fable, which collapses decades of that time period, which is now considered, or shall we say, kind of seen as the Anthropocene, with its beginnings, of course, in the rise of imperialism and colonialism in Europe as early as the 16th century, and brings it up right to our time. So it comes, it's a kind of a fabular retelling of an indigenized retelling, if you like, through the story of a particular small island, a vulnerable island, which and its kind of and the way its life revolves vitalistically around a particular mountain, which can be compared to Gondhamadon. In fact, Amitav Ghosh has done that I mean, he brings up the idea of Gondhamadon from Mahabharata and Ramayana in Nutmeg's Curse, and then kind of retells it or re-allegorizes it as a living mountain in in that eponymous fable. So it's a way of life around a sacred mountain, which is almost like we usually don't think of the mountain as maternal. But this particular mountain is presented as a nourisher, as not just a treasure trove, a resource hub, which really is what has what might be seen as a complete stark contrast, sometimes synonymous with uh, mercantilist drives, driven sometimes by organized religion, among other forces. So the living mountain, in many ways, is uh, epitomized as a mother figure, as a nourisher, who is not just inexhaustible in her ability to sustain both the human and the non-human population around it, but is able to do that in a way that sustains the equilibrium, sustains the balance of life, not kind of shall we say, privilege any particular one category of its shall we say, denizens over another. So it's a very ethical, even though it might be seen as primitive in terms of going back to roots that I said are usually tied up with the idea of indigeneity being a thing of the past. So it is indigenous in that it comes from earlier times of history, times that have been, as it were, covered up, have to be only have been concealed by palimpsestically, as it were, by later supposedly more progressive, advanced, technologically advanced civilizations, but which is actually more modern, more contemporary, and which can actually offer the kind of, if you like, cultural, ethical, and a leadership that is required by the world today. So, indigenous is also our, if you like, the word of salvation, the word that can actually help become rallying point around which the entire world can, uh, 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 in a way, reconceptualize the way forward, the way out of the global catastrophe that engulfs us at the moment. So, the indigenous, ironically or paradoxically, is also a way of thinking the planetary. The indigenous puts the earth at its center. The indigenous is a way of life that somewhere privileges the non, or I wouldn't say privileges, that accommodates the non-human, the supposedly inanimate. It is inclusive. It is generous. It is linguistically diverse. It is something that accommodates other ways of knowing and seeing, the kind of things that even, say, Rabindranath talks about in such a wide spectrum of his writings. So, indigenous today is a very, I wouldn't just say it's a political word. It might actually become that one magical word, uh, uh, through which a certain ethical uh, 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 solution may be arrived at for what, for the ravages, for a not particularly pleasant, not particularly happy legacy of the Anthropocene. And Amitav Ghosh, as he conceptualizes it, uh, for Amitav Ghosh, the Industrial Revolution, imperialism, colonialism, and the exploitation of nature are simply um, parallel, if not intersecting, uh, uh, historical milestones. So, uh, so well, for now, I'd probably pause there, and I might have more to say eventually. Yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We have Dr. Prem Phyak, sir. Uh, Dr. Prem Phyak is an indigenous Yakthum from Nepal. His research interests include in language policy, decolonial theories, teacher education, and social justice. He published numerous papers on these issues in different journals and edited volumes. Welcome, you, sir. So, our next speaker,
Thank you.
Dr. Shib Majumder, over to you, sir.
Uh, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay. Um, I'm so very thankful to Dr. Gupta ma'am for giving such a very broad introduction to the whole issue. And because my paper that I'm going to, or maybe the points that I'm going to raise in today's discussion are primarily peculiar to the region of Northeast and Assam, that is the southern part of Assam. So it had been in a way, or it would be, I believe, in a way helpful for me. So without much ado, I'm going to present some of the thoughts before the panel. The Surma Barak region of southern Assam is a land of amazing, diverse tradition and rich cultural heritage. The folk performative arts of the region are unique in their aesthetic orientation. The Oja Naach, or Oja dance, a folk performance form of Barak Valley, is an integral aspect of the ancient practice of ophiolatry or serpent worship. The cult of Monosha, alternatively known as Bishohori, is culturally very significant for some of the marginalized tribal and caste groups of northeastern region. In Borak Valley, the phenomenon of Monosha worship is primarily associated with the Kuivorto community, a community of agriculturalists and fishermen. Folk performance forms derive their energy from mundane concerns of human life through a vigorous fusion of dance, music, dialogue, uh, and performance. One of the primary factors which contribute to the survival and its patronization by the masses is its vitality. In India, folk performance genres are primarily known for their regional specificity, that is, their affiliation to a particular region or linguistic culture from which it emerges and where it thrives. Other important characteristics include its dependence on popular patronage, and its efficacy as a vehicle of mass entertainment. Cultural historians and anthropologists emphasize that ritualistic essence and religiosity have nourished folk performance forms for centuries. Now, the Oja Nach of Surma Barak Valley is closely connected to the tradition of Ojapali performance form of Brahmaputra Valley, especially the Suknanni or the Ojapali tradition that has thrived in Brahmaputra Valley. The term Suknanni originally presumes to have been derived from Shukobi Narayani. The Suknanni Ojapali performance form usually comprises of an Oja, the headman, the principal performer, a Dainapali, his consort, and two Akpalis and two Odapalis. Different kinds of rituals are performed by the Oja and the Daina. So this performance form has a religious origin, but over the years, in this performance form in Northeast, especially in this particular region, Southern Assam, it has been secularized. So these are some of the ideas that I'm going to present before the house. Renowned artist and folk enthusiast Mukundo Das Bhattacharya observes that traditionally the lead artists of Ojanach performance of Barak Valley are called Gurma, and the associated art form is also known as Gurma Nach. This has given rise to the debate whether all Oja performers of Barak, irrespective of their gender, can be called Gurmas. Gurmas are basically the head performers. Traditionally, the Gurmas have played a significant role in the Monasha worship rituals of the Kuivorto community. For centuries, through the enactment of uh, androgynous principles of Ardhanarishwara, the Gurmas nurtured a considerably complex art form. This idea has just been brought to the panel by my previous speaker, referring to Amitabh Ghosh's fiction. Because of the marginalized status of transgendered people in the society, Gurma dance has remained limited to ritualistic performances. At present, there are very few practicing transgender artists or priests within the Koiborto community of Barak Valley. The position of Gurma or community priest is not hereditary. Acceptability by the standards of traditional value system of Koibortos and the ability to sing, dance, and perform with Ilan are deemed to be crucial determinants for the position of Gurmas. Life of an Oja performer is limited by a set of socio-cultural norms or principles which he or she must uphold and mandatorily follow. This is of utmost significance in the context of Koiborto Ojas, who also play the role of faith healers in the community. As a customary aspect of Guru Shishya tradition, the mentor protege tradition, complete submission to the command of the Guru is a crucial aspect of the training of an apprentice artist. The Guru or the master chooses his disciple from within the community by identifying certain necessary or desirable virtues in the latter. The Shishya or the disciple is required to live with the master for a significant period of time, since certain specialized aspects of the ritual and the performance form are transmitted orally. Both Ojanach and Ojapali have been traditionally nurtured within the ancient ethos of Guru Shishya Parampara, where the learner undergoes a prolonged rigorous training stretching for 10 to 12 days, 10 to 12 years under the supervision of a master before his or her eventual initiation into the status of an Oja. This art requires excellent command over singing, dancing, recitation, acting, and it also patronizes absolute and unflinching devotion. Prioritizes absolute and unflinching devotion and dedication to the Guru as well as to the deity from the artist. In Borak Valley, Ojanach performance groups usually comprise of 6 to 7 members, where the Oja is the lead singer. Musicians and other assistant performers accompany the Oja on the stage or the performance space. A ritual performance begins with vandana or invocation to the deity. The deity is usually Monosha or Bishohari, followed by the performance and closure. So it is vandana first of the deity and then of the performance space, the village deity, then the Adi Guru and or the Oja's parents, etc. Now, gradually, I'll be coming towards this secularized, the process of secularization which this performance forms has undergone over the years. In southern Assam, there are four prominent Monosha worship ceremonies: Shravani Puja, Panchami Puja or Nag Panchami, Nauka Puja, or Dorai Bishohari Puja, alternatively also known as Dorai Broto. This is something very special, peculiar and special, which I would like to explain. The epithet Dorai is a synonym for the serpent deity, which evokes a sense of fear in her devotees. In Sylheti, the regional language, the regional dialect, in Sylheti dialect, Dorai means to be scared of someone or something. The phenomenon of Dorai Bishohori is almost an exclusive affair of the Koibortos of the region. Women from the fishermen community observe the Dorai Broto for the well-being of their loved ones. The rituals of this worship can only be performed by an androgynous priest, who is called Gurma. Dance, music, and recital with the incantation are inevitable aspects of the Dorai Puja. Night-long celebrations of the quasi-mythical exploits of the deity by the Gurma performers with dance and music may turn out to be bawdy or overtly sexual at times. At the time of the performance, the rituals of the Gurmas use the rituals that the Gurmas perform with the help of chamors, a soft or and a tender fly brush like object. The elaborate rituals of Dorai Bishori Puja are performed in a more serious and somber tone compared to the other folk popular performance forms of this particular region. In Borak Valley, throughout the month of Shabana, that is July August, the devotees indulge in choral singing of Manosha Mongol, which can be seen in different parts of Eastern India. Though Ojanat is not an integral aspect of Shravani Puja, sometimes special performances are organized to celebrate the exploits of the serpent deity. According to the folk belief, Behula carries her husband Lokhindor's corpse towards heaven. Uh, uh, and she Behula, on the request of the gods, she performs in Indra's Sabha. So sometimes the Oja performers they imitate that particular anecdote from Manosha Mongol. The Oja begins the performance with with an invocation to the Puranic deities. The performance space is usually a temple courtyard which is surrounded by spectators from all sides, except a small opening towards the direction where Manosha idol is placed. Performance ensues with the playing of musical instruments for a while, followed by invocations. Since the Monosha lore is very familiar in the region, preliminaries are kept to the minimum. Through an intricate combination of song, dance, and vandana or the incantation, the Oja invites the deity to join the ritual ceremony. uh, a popular song which is sung by most of the ojas. I will try to just uh, recite some of the lines of this particular song. ও তোমরা দেখো গো আসিয়া ভালো নৃত্য করণ শাহের নন্দিনী মনোহর বেশ ধরি নৃত্য করণ সুন্দরী নৃত্য ভুলাইল দেব ত্রিপুরারি মনোহর বেশ ধরি নৃত্য করৈন সুন্দরী, which can be literally translated like this: oh, you please come and witness the beautiful dance of Shaha's daughter. Behula is from the business community, so Shah is a particular community which has been traditionally associated with uh, marine trade. The beautiful dame dances wearing attractive attire. Her dance has enchanted Tripurari, which is another name for Shiva. The beautiful dame dances wearing attractive attire. So these kinds of songs are part of that particular performance. From the last few decades of the previous century, there has been an effort to secularize the Ojan art so that it could be presented to an on an urban platform as a popular art form. According to an estimate, by the end of 1990s, in Borak Valley, there were at least 30 fully professional Oja performance groups, and most of the artists affiliated to these groups were from the lower caste. Unlike the traditional Ojanat, which is only performed during Monosha worship ceremonies, its artistic representations are now showcased during festivals and cultural exhibitions. Compared to the ritualistic Ojanat, its urban representations are more quote unquote exhibitionist in nature. Contrary to the ritualistic performances of Ojanat, which is quote unquote faith centric, its representation in urban performance is often as an quote unquote art. There are several striking differences between the religious and the artistic version of the Oja performance. The ritualistic Oja Nach performances are expected to continue for 3 to 7 nights at a stretch for the complete rendition of the Padma Purana. Padma Purana narrative, whereas its artistic representation focus on choices, episodes, or events from the Padma Purana, from the Manusha Mongol narratives for a very limited period of time. Whereas religious or ritualistic performances mandatorily begin with an elaborate bandhana or invocation to the deities mixed with incantation and other kinds of uh, other kinds of associated practices. Uh, the exhibitionist performers usually begin abruptly. During ritualistic performances, only folk musical instruments are used, whereas during exhibitionist performances these days, especially during the course of last few decades, we have seen they are using a whole range of modern musical instruments. Across the Indian subcontinent, folk popular performance traditions have continuously interacted with elite classical traditions, and there are abundant examples on the fact that folk culture and more specifically folk performance forms have been imagined as a dependent category which cannot be properly understood or analyzed without a reference to the elitist or classical traditions. However, with the advent of Western modernity, there occurred a disjuncture between the classical and the folk traditions. During the previous centuries, folk traditions and performance forms were increasingly viewed with a sense of disdain. These were often labeled as quote unquote degenerate art forms, quote unquote impoverished, and quote unquote primitive in essence, not worthy of attention to the sophisticated classes. Because of its geographical remoteness and isolation, Borak Valley could sustain some folk art and performance forms which are unique. As a region located far from Bengal heartland, to which it remained culturally and politically aligned for centuries, this valley suddenly discovered its cultural affinity with Assam after partition. From the final few decades of the previous century, there has been a growing sense of resurgence and consolidation among the Bengali speaking marginal caste groups of Borak Valley. In this cultural consolidation of folk beliefs, folk art and cultural forms are playing a very crucial role as an expression of identity and resistance against the hegemony of superior castes. Monosha, as the supreme deity of Koivortos, occupy a privileged position in this assertion of ethnic identity. Increasingly, Monosha's story also foregrounds a considerably long narrative of struggle of the serpent deity to acquire a divine status. She continuously challenged the hierarchy of Hindu pantheon in an attempt to overcome her status as a marginal god. She puts up an epic battle with Chand Saudagar, a devotee of Shiva, to claim a divine status and establish a lineage of devotees. In the present context of Borak Valley, the parallel in the struggle for identity between the worshippers of Monosha and the worshipped appear rather fascinating. There are ample sociological evidence on the fact that Monosha is not equally worshipped or revered by all caste groups among the Bengali speaking people. Her genealogy has always been particularly associated with the what Riskova says, and I quote her, people of specific low castes, unquote. Pradot Maiti emphasizes that throughout the late medieval period, quote, relationship of Monosha with the lower classes of society remained constant, unquote, which continued till date. These dominant Monosha narratives situate her within the canon of marginal deities of the marginalized sections and other marginalized deities like Shitola and Shosti. This is the reason why, in spite of rapid proliferation in the number of our devotees among the higher caste groups recently, Monosha is widely presumed to be the savior of the marginalized. In and I'm almost coming towards the end of my presentation now. Oja artists of Borak Valley also claim that the mythical dancing couple of Indrashobha, Usha and Aniruddha, where they reincarnated as Behula and Lokhinder in the Monosha narrative. There is a long history of denial of classical status to the Ojanaj performance form in spite of its claim of a quasi-mythical origin. In India, there are certain elitist parameters based on which an art form is classified as folk or classical. in case of a dance form, for example, the distinctive feature associated with the classical dances, like aesthetic background, tradition, representation, relationship with classical texts and antiquity, has always been a detrimental aspect for Ojanas to be recognized as a uh, classical art form. To a certain extent, all these features are present within Ojanach, and it is believed to be very closely associated with classical dance forms. Yet, it is categorized as a folk form. So, in my paper, as I have also said before, that I try to highlight these three distinct aspects: that what is the religious aspect, or what is the religious association of Ojanach performance form of Barak Valley, and how comes it has also been sometimes questioned and were considered not worthy of performance because of its association with some of the sexual taboos. That is the profaneness, that is the profane aspect of this particular performance, and it is a very popular art form in southern Assam these days, and this popularity is somewhere, as I have tried to argue in my paper, or in this particular presentation, uh, this particular popularity is also partly due to the assertion of identity of the marginalized caste groups. So this is how I would like to bring an end to my presentation. Thank you for the patient listening.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, I would like to request Dr. Prem Phyak, sir, to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. So can you hear me well? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm not really, I don't have really a paper written. So, but I take more, language and as a center of cultural revitalization and transfer of culture from one generation to another generation. So, talking about Nepal's cultural, revitalization efforts, language is always at the center. So, but I will take more critical perspective. So, in relation to political situation. So in Nepal, so I come from, for example, one of the indigenous communities, Yakthung, and as as in indigenous communities, so we have, of course, rich folk literature, language practices, and um, you know mostly collective epistemologies, for example. Um, so Limbus and other indigenous groups have their own knowledge systems and values. But I basically study how these cultural practices are not really um, you know kind of like transfer from one generation to another generations. And the one key factor that affect the transfer of cultural practices and knowledge from one generation to another generation is education, broader education policies. So that's what I study. And for long in Nepal, and I think it it applies to South Asian regions as well. So we have this very monolingual, monocultural education policies, and and which means basically, for example, the medium of instruction is one language, and the textbooks mostly for long in the context of Nepal up to 1990s, and still the textbook contents, right, and also the language policies used in schools uh, is mostly not really multicultural and multilingual. So this leads to this construction of deficit ideology of indigenous languages, knowledge, and cultures. So which includes, of course, art, of course, because for me, like learning, teaching, and educating yourself is a form of art. For example, teaching in the classroom is also a form of art. And when I say form of art, so basically we reproduce the textbook knowledge, right? And it's a given set of ideologies and values about assessment and quality of education. All these values are mostly monocentric and monocultural, and there are gaps and lack of alternative practices, recognizing, of course, indigenous ways of knowing and learning, right? For example, in Yakfung community, or where I come from, so we have very rich epistemologies. For example, Mundum. So we believe in Mundum. So our everyday life, our ways of knowing, our you know our epistemologies are all shaped by Mundum. So which builds on collective identities, builds on this ecological knowledge, and builds on very much like folk traditions of communicating. And there are different ways of learning, right? So very rich sources of knowledge, including weaving, for example, and preservation of food, right, and plantation, and of course, in broader sense, the knowledge of ecology, climate, and all those things. So, but my, I always see that, because of this very narrow sense of um, education as schooling, right? So we often see, uh, you know, education and schooling as synonymous. But most often, when indigenous children go to school, um, they don't see their languages, the cultures represented, and more importantly, they don't see their ways of knowing or ways of learning and the set of knowledge in textbooks, and also the performances of the teachers and schools in general. So and most often the schools and the policies reproduce the ideology of linguistic separatism or cultural separatism, for example, right? And this actually contributes to the construction of deficit views about languages and cultures, right? So rather than being more specific, what I'm trying to say here is uh, a specific culture. What I'm trying to say is, so we really need to, if we talk about revitalization of languages and cultures and indigenous epistemologies, it's really important to review and critically assess our ideologies and policies that shape our ways of learning, and also the ways of creating policies and implementing them. Most often, there is always another issue that I would like to highlight is there is always a kind of like the assumption that the knowledge that we produce, or the knowledge that we transfer to younger generation, is mostly the knowledge that is recognized or legitimized within the broader framework of modernity and neoliberal values, for example, right? So now what happens is, if we really keep reproducing these ideologies, the spaces for indigenous languages, indigenous cultures, and knowledge systems actually remain unseen and invisible. So for example, my own story, so I was actually born and raised in Yakthum community, learning multiple languages, and of course my first language is Yakthum. language, right? And when I talk to my parents and community members, it feels that I have to use Yakthung, right? But when I started my schooling, I'm not using education as a schooling synonymously. When I in my schooling up to now, I don't really see the institutional arrangements that actually promote the use of indigenous values and knowledges. When I say indigenous values and knowledges, it doesn't just mean that they should be simply part of textbooks and policy, but you know they should be embraced as alternative forms of learning and knowledge construction. So there is always a kind of hierarchy between indigenous languages and mainstream languages and cultures and values, and that happens in I think in the case of India and of course South Asia in general, that we always see more often like culture as part of nationalism. And when you say like Nepali culture, it's mostly like mainstream uh, Hindu ways of knowing and cultures, for example. So this what I'm trying to basically say is language plays really critical role in the constructions of whether we value indigenous languages in our systems, basically institutional arrangement. So if we are really concerned with the revitalization of indigenous languages and culture and creating spaces in institutions such as education, it's really important for us to questions and review the institutional arrangements that we have up to now, right? So of course there are efforts and at the community level, and that is what I really um, like to highlight. So it's always important to focus on community engagement and see how communities are reclaiming what agency communities have and what ideologies and values communities have towards creating spaces of their language and cultures in mainstream institutions. So without really questioning the structures that we have, and without actually reviewing the spaces that were erased for indigenous languages and how we can create spaces for indigenous languages and culture. So it's again, maybe for me, maybe we may kind of like keep reproducing the dominant ideologies and practices that would not be really helpful for creating spaces for indigenous languages. So I think I would stop here. So what I'm basically trying to say is, in order to actually create spaces, visible spaces for indigenous languages, culture, and arts, I think language is at the center, and language. When we are centralizing the role of language, it's really important to see educational spaces, right? So where most younger generations first, see or do not see the you know the representation of their cultures, arts, and performances. And that's the education is the first schools and educational institutions are the first place for younger generations to learn about, or do not learn about the value of their indigenous languages and cultures. So, and which is very critical because in South Asian regions, we long have like this coloniality rather than colonialism, right? The coloniality of these different colonial ideologies, including monoculturalism. Uh, and now, consistently, we focus on commodifications of the cultures and language and arts as well, right? So, most often, when we commodify, we believe in the commodifications of language, cultures, and arts as something that that is that only the forms of arts and performances in language that are really valued in the market receive the spaces in broader in mainstream society. So I would stop here. So my point is we really need to uh, while we are talking about the indigenous languages and culture, we really need to critically review the policies, not just education. So, but I highlight the role of education a lot. But we really need to review our own ideologies and policies and practices. So yeah, I think I would stop with this, and if there are any questions, so I'm happy to address later. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir. And sir has some family emergencies, so I want to ask him just one question before coming to Annoy, sir. Are there any human rights-based restrictions on traditional or cultural practices of indigenous peoples that are undertaken in the name of the religion or spirituality of indigenous people?
In the context of Nepal, I mean, in terms of rights, right? The rights-based discourses and right-based policies are very clear. I mean, the constitution recognizes the rights of indigenous people, right? And basically, in terms of like language, right, and preservation and promotion of language, culture, arts, communities are given rights to promote their language, cultures, and arts. But what I'm basically saying is the institutional arrangements that we have, right, developed for long, and the ideologies that we have been reproducing for long, are not really that friendly towards, right, I should say, towards creating spaces or recognizing the spaces of indigenous languages, cultures, and values. As I said, like communities are doing very, it's a wonderful job in terms of promoting and advocating for language rights, cultural rights. But still, they remain at the community level, right? So, and the visibility of these languages and cultures and arts, I mean, they, they are not really become part of like mainstream knowledge, right, for example. And because the institutional arrangements, including policies and the ways of teaching in schools, for example, it is still that very modernist and not really giving alternative spaces for indigenous knowledge and culture. So yeah, I think in terms of rights, there is no issues, right? So human rights, language is a human rights, cultural rights, preservation of languages, and all recognized in the constitution. So but I often see the gap between constitutional rights and constitutional provisions and and practice, right, in general. So and basically it happens through education, because in schooling, right, because we have been telling through our teaching and through our ideologies to younger generations that these are the sets of knowledge that are legitimate. But there are so many ways of learning that children have developed, right, from their home communities, particularly in indigenous communities. So yeah, I think there are not really many issues with rights in the constitutions or laws, right? But I'm really talking about how they work, right, in practice, right, and and through different channels, institutional arrangements such as education.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Our next speaker is Dr. Anway Mukhopadhyay. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Now, it's good that I have now heard all the speeches so that I can refer to the earlier talks in my speech. It's good to see Ananya after a long period of time. Earlier, we were neighbors academically as well as geographically. So, Bardhaman and Bolpur, Bardhaman University and Vishabharati. Now, it's good that Ananya referred to that book by Ghosh, Amitabh Ghosh's Living Mountain, because I have been working on this book as well, and it's a very interesting book. And what is more interesting is that in this work, he is actually talking about not just the symbolic figurations of the indigenous, but also probably what is happening in the real political space. So it's a political allegory as well. And in fact, there can be certain direct connections drawn between what he depicts in that book and what is happening around us. For instance, we think about the Niyamgiri movement in Odisha. I mean, exactly the same thing. The indigenous people actually fought for maintaining the sacrality of their land, the sacrality of the mountain rather. And interestingly, while theoretically speaking, we can talk about a new turn in the Western thought over the Anthropocene, over environment, etc. For instance, we have the discourse of new materialism, and in fact, Ghosh's work squares with that as well. If you think about that book, Vibrant Matter, so Vibrant Matter, Vibrant Mountain, Living Water, etc. Now, I have been working on that too. But what is interesting is that Ghosh is not just talking about the problem of the Anthropocene or the necessity to look at the human beings from the perspective of the post-human epistemologists, but rather he is also talking about the position of the underprivileged human beings in the context of a post-human imaginary. And that's what I find so interesting about Ghosh. For instance, if you think about this discourse of the post-human or even the Anthropocene, what we are often missing is that the category of the human or the anthropos is not a homogeneous category. For instance, in terms of powers, in terms of privileges, in terms of the very epistemology of the human, there are gradations, there are hierarchies, right? So that's the problem with understanding the indigenous communities and their problems. They have specific problems, as the previous speaker had pointed out. You have a kind of disconnect between the rights and what is happening on the ground, and all these problems are there. But since I am a religious studies scholar, I will have to talk about religions and the practical problems of preserving the repository of indigenous cultures and religions. I would talk about the problems with methodologies as well. For instance, when you think about ethnography, in fact, some scholars working with me at IIT Kharagpur are working on certain indigenous communities, so I know about the problems, the ground level problems, and the theoretical problems about preserving certain indigenous religions and the methodological problems are actually interconnected. Now I will come to that. Why do I say that there are certain problems? I mean, why is it not the case that you should just go to the field and build up an archive, even a kind of living archive of oral narratives and all that? Is it so easy? No. Why? Because when you think about the indigenous religions, there are certain spaces kept for the sacred, and you would often find that the sacred and the secret would come together, they overlap. So what is sacred is also kept a secret. So you are not supposed to deal with that. Now that is a problem, because if I think that I have to preserve certain indigenous religious structures, and so I need to know everything about these religions, then that is actually some kind of epistemological arrogance which goes against the grain of the ethical paradigm that I should be working with while trying to preserve the indigenous cultures and religions. Secondly, when we talk about the indigenous cultures, we need to remember that there you actually don't have always the gap between the sacred and the secular. So you can't really sort of take out something from the indigenous cultures saying that it is secular, so I am going to display it as the secular, my secular findings from this indigenous framework of existence, and there is something religious which is going to be pushed to the periphery. It's not like that. Rather, I think we have to work with the category of the sacred secular, the theoretical category of the sacred secular that Latamani talks about, that Raymond Panikkar talks about. If we think about the indigenous cultures from that perspective, then I think we can approach it better. But at the same time, I would say that the ethnographer's arrogance has to be avoided. For instance, you have to respect the space that is given to the secret and the sacred within an indigenous cultural formation. If you don't do that, then the very purpose of trying to preserve that religion will be falsified. Having said that, it's also important to preserve the indigenous cultures and religions. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have this idea that it should be preserved or that there shouldn't be a repository. My only point is that when we talk about the repository of indigenous cultures and religions, we should think about metaphors other than the archive, or even an archive of oral narratives that you transcribe and textualize. So it's not just a textualization of what is there in an oral format. It's more than that. It's about understanding a different religion. It's about understanding the dynamics of that religion vis-a-vis the larger domain of religions, plural. And it is also important to think about the decolonization, the possible decolonization of religious studies. We need to critique the very idea of world religions, where we just think about some macro religions and we completely forget about, the religions of which are, there are in fact multiple religions, hundreds and thousands of religions which are practiced by different indigenous communities. And secondly, we must understand that just as we have to talk about indigenous peoples, indigenous communities, we have to appreciate the plurality of the indigenous experiences. Similarly, we have to talk about the indigenous religions and their plural frameworks as well. For instance, whenever we talk about indigenous religions, at a planetary scale, or even at the level, at a pan-Indian level, we need to remind ourselves that we are not talking about a singular framework. Of course, you might find out certain similarities, certain parallels between different indigenous religions, but that doesn't mean that they are all the same, that they are homogeneous. No, there are very significant differences between them as well. For instance, if you want to think about the cosmogonies, if you want to think about the pantheons, if you want to think about the different kinds of figurations of the divine that are prevalent in these different communities, we will find that there are huge differences between one community and another, even though they might actually be similar in many other terms and many other ways as well. So this is something which we have to remind ourselves. We have to start with this ethical principle of respecting this radical plurality of indigenous experiences and indigenous imaginaries. Now, secondly, what is important here is that when we talk about indigenous cultures or indigenous communities or indigenous religions, we have to respectfully look at their worldviews as well. And this is something which some recent indigenous studies scholars have pointed out. For instance, there is a book edited by Maguni Charan Behera. It's called Travel Studies in India, where Behera comes up with some new ideas about the directions that indigenous studies should take in India. And there is this idea in this book, the idea foregrounded by this book rather, that when we talk about the indigenous communities, we should understand that historicity is perceived, concept of, and practiced in radically different ways by the indigenous communities than what we see as historicity, or what the colonial masters used to see as historicity. And unfortunately, as far as the cultural elite of India are concerned, their idea of history is actually deeply influenced by the colonial perception of history, and that is something which we need to rectify. If we don't rectify that, then the very idea of preserving the indigenous cultures and religions would become just another offshoot of our new imperialist academic projects. And unfortunately, whenever we talk about digitally archiving these cultures and all that, what we tend to forget is that there is a difference between a reified representation of something that is happening out there and the cultural performance or the religious experience which is present there at the real level, at the ground level. And what is important in this context is that when we talk about religious experience, to be very particular, we need to talk about not just performances, but also experiences. For instance, how do the people there perceive something at a subjective level, right? So there is a deity, there is some kind of cultural performance, there is a ritual. Fine, but how does it impact the community there? How does it impact the community at the collective level and at the individual level? For instance, it's not just about the perception of the community about that ritual. You also need to look at the different cross sections of that community, and you need to see how they are looking at that ritual. What are the intergenerational dimensions of their engagements with these rituals? What are the gender dimensions? What are the dimensions in terms of social hierarchies, if any, which are there? So that is very important. And unfortunately, in the case of India, you actually don't have, and here I come to the point of the sheer importance of preserving the repository of indigenous cultures and religions, especially indigenous religions, because that's what I should concentrate on. I mean, when you look for the details of the religious frameworks of different indigenous communities, suppose you want to know more about, the cosmogony of the Lotha community or the Shabbat community, you find meager material even on the internet in today's world, right? So you understand that most of the studies on the communities are anthropological in nature. Unfortunately, I would say they are not, following the paradigms of cultural studies or religious studies. For instance, when you follow the paradigms of religious studies, you are not supposed to look at a community only in anthropological terms. You have to do a lot of other things as well. It's not just a part of cultural anthropology, it's more than that. So when we look at the indigenous communities, whether in India or elsewhere, we have to think about the ways in which they formulate their philosophical ideas. So if we believe that only the major world religions have their theologies or philosophies, and these communities have only religious performances, and I am also a bit troubled by the repeated use of the term performances in various discourses about the indigenous religions, as if there is just performance and no philosophy behind that. It's not like that. There is also a worldview which informs that kind of performance, and that worldview has to be negotiated with in a respectful way. So whenever you are talking about religions, be it an indigenous religion or a non-indigenous religion, you need to have the same paradigms and parameters, right? Whether in terms of theory or methodology or your ideological approach. So you can't approach these religious frameworks just as certain ritualistic performances. You have to look beyond what is there, what is visible at the surface level, and you have to look at the worldviews that shape and inform these performances. So that is another requirement. And apart from that, there is also the issue of religious hybridity when we talk about indigenous religions in India. For instance, you would often find, and it's not just about India, it's about the global spectrum of indigenous religions as well. For instance, in Peru, you have this figure of Our Lady of the Amazon, where the indigenous sort of figurations of the divine feminine get amalgamated with and hybridized with the figure of Mary. Similarly, in India, you have a lot of hybridization taking place between indigenous deities and deities from other religions. The cult of Jagannath in Orissa is one of the finest examples, for instance, because Jagannath was associated originally with the Shavara Tantra. So that kind of thing is there. And then if you think about this entire discourse of goddess worship, that's my core area, so I would like to talk about that a bit. When you think about goddess worship, you find that there are actually organic links between the kinds of goddess worship that you find in folk Hinduism and the kinds of goddess worship that you find in many indigenous communities. For instance, if you look at certain forms of goddess worship, in the region bordering between, say, West Bengal and Orissa, the region where I'm located now, you will find that there is a very peculiar kind of mixture of the indigenous religious practices and folk Hindu practices. For instance, we have a temple here, it's called Gupta, where where the goddess is worshipped as Durga, but you have a priest from the indigenous community. So the priest is not a Brahmin priest. So a lot of hybridization is there. Another example would be the example of the various forms of Chandi. In fact, Chandi is the very name of the goddess, which sort of cuts across different communities, different cultural spectrums in India. For instance, if you think about the Sanskritic version of Chandi as Chandika, then that is something. But you also have a lot of folk figurations of Chandi, and we all know that a kind of synthesis between these two forms of Chandi is attempted by Kubikampon Mukhopadhyay in the Chandi Mangal or Abhaya Mangal. And in fact, the goddess of Chandi Mangal or Abhaya Mangal is a goddess whom you can find in different avatars when you find, when you visit different places in West Midnapur and Jhargram, which is especially rich in indigenous cultures. And in fact, I have visited a lot of places here where you have this peculiar kind of hybridization. So on the one hand, you have the figuration of the goddess as Dutta, as the Hindu goddess, but on the other hand, you understand that the indigenous goddess is also present there. For instance, if you go to some rural regions here, you will find non-iconic presentations, or rather presence of the goddess. For instance, you might find certain terracotta figurines there, but you don't have an image of the goddess. But when you go to the city of Midnapur, the urban location, you find that the same type of goddess figuration is taking a different kind of shape. For instance, you will find a face of the goddess with the three eyes and all that. So the point is that when we talk about, but that doesn't mean that it's just a matter of assimilation or a matter of appropriation. In fact, there are points of confrontation as well as conversation. So we have to look at it in that way. And we also need to think about the differences between the assimilation happening between, say, one monotheistic culture and one polytheistic culture, and the kind of assimilation that happens between two polytheistic cultures. Because we all know that when we talk about a monotheistic culture, we don't really talk about a pantheon, a polytheistic pantheon. So when we talk about polytheistic pantheons from different religious frameworks interacting with each other and getting mixed up, then we have a different kind of complexity which has to be thought of, not just in terms of sensitization or Hinduization or in terms of cultural appropriation or assimilation, but in other terms, in terms of hybridization, where you have confrontational hybridization as well as conversational hybridization. So that is very important. And secondly, not secondly, in fact, I have said so many things, so why should I talk about secondly? But the point that I would like to underline towards the end of my presentation is that the issue of commodification is also very important. Now, I would talk about it from the perspective of religious studies, not from the perspective of just cultural studies or linguistic studies, but as my previous speakers have pointed out, it's very, very important to look at the dynamics of commodification when we talk about indigenous cultures, because most often what happens is that in the name of preserving indigenous cultures, people might tend to commodify these cultures, right? For instance, if you believe that just a mask of chow dance becomes, a part of your cultural repository, and you don't need to look beyond that artifact, you don't need to look at the the religious ideas, the cultural ideas, the social perception which are there behind this performance of chow naach, then you are actually commodifying it. If you think that you can just take some artifact from an indigenous community and display it, then you are just following the footsteps of the colonial masters, and this is very unfortunate. Unfortunately, in many of the cases, we in post-colonial India are trying to follow that kind of paradigm, right? And Ananya was talking about Tagore. Tagore was someone who understood this problem, and that's why he always promoted a different kind of discourse of preservation, a different kind of discourse of negotiation. And yet, I would say that Tagore had a problem with the indigenous religions, and that's why you have so many types of documentation of his interest in indigenous cultures. But I don't find a similar kind of interest in indigenous religions in Tagore's corpus of works. Abanindranath had some kind of interest, and that's a different story. But as far as Tagore is concerned, I think there was not that kind of engagement, an equal sort of level of engagement with indigenous religions, even though he lived in close proximity to some regions which were and still are rich in indigenous cultures. And in fact, since I work on the tantras, I know about it. When you think about the tantric culture, you can't just talk about Sanskrit tantric texts. You can't just talk about what is there, what is accepted in mainstream Hinduism. So it's not just what is already textualized. In fact, a very huge portion of tantric culture is still oral, and it remains oral, and it is not just Hindu or Buddhist or Jain. It's also indigenous to a very great extent. If you closely look at the different practices within the tantric fold, you will find that there are different types of tantra that that emerge from the Adivasi cultures, and the Adivasi tantric practitioners still practice them. So when we talk about indigenous religions, we have to factor in all these issues, and we have to go on with this motto that we are going to preserve that, because that's very important. But this preservation is going to be a preservation of a very different type, and it shouldn't be something like this, that I am just going to represent the indigenous people. It's not like that. You have to work with the community members. You have to work with the different sectors and segments of that community. For instance, how are the elders looking at it? How are the younger generations looking at it? What are the points of convergence and divergence between their perspectives? If you really want to preserve those cultures, if you really want to build up a repository, then, as I said, you have to respect what is not shared by them with you as much as what is shared by them with you. Then you have to think about the worldviews, okay, which might be expressed not just through narratives but through other forms as well. I mean, these worldviews might be expressed through visual figurations as well. So all of that needs to be factored in. And as I said, any attempt at binarizing the spiritual and the material, the secular and the sacred, own to do, that doesn't mean that you should exoticize the indigenous religions and cultures by saying that there everything is religious, everything is ritualistic. It's not like that. But the point is that that discourse of the sacred and the secular that we work with has to be revised before we negotiate with this different cultures. So my only point is that you have to think about and negotiate with a radical form of cultural alterity, sometimes revising your own points of view and your own received epistemologies and received ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So, with this, now we move on to the question answer round of today's segment. So, my first question is for Ananya ma'am. Many people spoke of indigenous spirituality as a way of life and way of knowing that was centered on a relationship with the creator, the land, and all our relations. So these usually included all our beings and forms of life, including what are commonly perceived as inanimate objects, which were generally seen to be attached with a spirit or a soul. So what do you think? What kinds of changes they faced in last 50 years? So over to you, Anunadi.
Well, the changes are in I mean, I guess the best way to go about it would be to see climate change as something that has accelerated the process of endangerment of these communities, of these people, and places, if you like. So there's a kind of indistinguishability, which is very important here in the way we should define the indigenous. It's a place and a people who are inseparable from each other. That itself, I think, is something that we ought to recognize. You can only think of the indigenous as ecologically defined. It is only something that can be defined in terms of the spatiality that they inhabit. So I for one would see climate change as the most, shall we say, um, uh, uh, almost apocalyptic kind of force at work in terms of how it is affecting the future and indeed the present of these communities. And we are looking at what's happening in terms of the storms and the hurricanes, and how the small islands across the world are already in danger. And there's a kind of in many ways, this is a rather dangerous homogenization of faiths. So in a way, different peoples across the world who are denizens of these archipelagos, regardless of whether they're in the West or in the East, the world has literally come round. In the climate change has actually, in a way, helped underline the um, the circularity, the fact that we are a sphere, the sphericality, if you like, of global experience, and particularly how we may negotiate these changes. So I don't suppose what is happening in the last 50 years is materially different from what may have happened in previous age or earlier ages. It's simply that these processes have been accelerated, and therefore the solutions, which is such a crass word, there cannot be any solution. There can be only ways of negotiation and ways of redressal, if you like. These have to be sought in a way that I guess Anway was gesturing towards, consensually, in dialogue with such people, and in recognition of their practices, not just cultural, but, as you so rightly pointed out, religious practices. And here I would like to bring in Deepesh Chakraborty, the other very kind of I don't mean magisterial in the political sense, but he's such a prescient voice in this. So I was thinking about his book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, and he talks about the need to return to the idea of reverence, which is so central to how indigenous communities negotiate religion. And in a way, they are organically, they are, their culture situates religion in a kind of triangulation with nature, which is very important here. So you cannot but talk the sacral if you're talking the indigenous. You cannot separate the sacral from the vitalistic, from the material. So that those divisions, those disciplinary boundaries become totally irrelevant. So that is something that I thought would be important. And I also, perhaps I'm approaching this a little theoretically, but I mean, of course, the kind of hybridization that um, uh, that Anway was referring to, in practice in a particular community, border community. Border, by the way, reminds me of Wordsworth's play Borderers. Border is always that liminal space which we need to acknowledge as a productive space where hybridization takes place almost kind of compulsively. So in this context, we ought to remember that there's another text which I didn't get to speak about, Jungle Nama, where which does not just recognize the plurality of or within indigenous practices, which is very important, but also the possibility of creating a hybrid space between the major organized religions alongside these indigenous faiths. So he has an afterword at the after in Jungle Nama, where he talks about how the Dokhin Rai legend, which has come up earlier in the Gun Island also, and also has overlaps with the Monosha legend that Dr. Majumder was referring to. And these are these extraordinarily interesting. So mythology is the place where true hybridization takes place. So we are the forum that we are we are we are part of today, Tell Me Your Story, has certain very kind of interesting intersections with the idea of myth. And mythology is the space where religions come together, and religions kind of gesture, acknowledge one another's shall we say, coexistence. So this is something that fascinatingly comes out in Jungle Nama. I thought that was important to register. As far as the theoretical framework, and I'll come to that later. But the other thing that I found interesting is the centrality given to the f- you know the f- the f- to women as repositories. I don't know what Anway would have to say about this, or whether Dr. Majumder has seen this in the kind of performative practices that he was in a way reporting to us. The centrality given to women in indigenous communities, a certain kind of something that interestingly is also being evoked in mainstream cinema around indigenous cultures. We have seen a kind of revival of indigeneity in mainstream cinema, global cinema, and I'm deliberately using the word global. The global is really gesturing towards the planetary in films like Avatar, in a very recent film, which is what was that? Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. So the we are looking at women taking upon themselves the agency and responsibility for restoring indigeneity, and I found that this gendering of uh, a gendered response, a very perhaps something that we perhaps need to kind of take into account or take cognizance of, something that seems to counter the masculinist magisterial drive of the main, the organized religions, the monotheistic religions, which are always kind of paternally oriented. I don't know if I'm right, kind of academically right there. I'm probably speaking empirically and intuitively, but I guess this is something that also resonated with me when I was reading Amitav Ghosh's texts. Which in Jungle Nama, for instance, is talking about a return to mother. I mentioned this to somebody. Christianity thinks of the return of the prodigal son as necessarily a return to the father, whereas in Jungle Nama, in his retelling of the Bono Bibi Dokhin Rai lore, the 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 telos really is to return to the grieving mother, restoration to the nourishing mother, restoration also of the mother becomes very important. So there's also a kind of underlying equation somewhere, a mythic equation of mother with earth, with forces of nature, and the non-humans seem to be subsumed under that. Which can have its own problematic, which is also a certain kind of homogenization. I would grant that to Dr. Mukhopadhyay, but it also gives a certain kind of healing agency to a segment of the population that is generally not seen as the as agentic. So women of such communities are now coming to the fore, as we know that there are lots of indigenous women activists from indigenous communities who are coming up and speaking about climate change and the danger it poses to island nations at international forums. So I believe there's a kind of we can think in terms of Jungle Nama and such texts, or even Dipesh Chakraborty is providing the theoretical framework for looking at what they are doing. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And we will move on to Professor Sipshankar sir. And my question to you, sir, is: does commercialization or homogenization of certain indigenous peoples' cultures, traditions, and histories affect their religion or spiritual practices? What do you think about this?
I mean, I'll be very brief in my response because I was basically highlighting the case of the Koiborto community in southern Assam. Uh, this particular community, as I tried to also highlight through my presentation, is that there is a resurgence of identity, tremendous resurgence of this identity, and like this indigeneity question or this issue that we have been dwelling on for last 1.5 hours in this particular platform. In Northeast, it's a hugely important political issue where there are different kind of migrant groups from across Southeast Asia, uh, almost all of which are claiming themselves to be indigenous to this particular land. Now, the Koibortos, the agrarian fishermen community of southern Assam, they are one of the latest migrants, but they also claim indigeneity to this particular land. So that actually problematizes the thing all over once again. I mean, and then this commodification, of their religious beliefs of some a part of their traditional cultural system, uh, that cannot be denied. It's happening, and to a certain extent, though I agreed with most of the things, and I actually have learned some of the things from Dr. Mukherjee, and I'm indebted to him for bringing these issues so very powerfully to this particular platform. I'm pretty hopeful that I will get back to him and try to imbibe some of these ideas that he has so very beautifully placed in this particular platform. Uh, Referring to Dr. Professor Dutta Gupta, is this particular fact that some of these priests of Koiborto community who perform or the puja, the worship ceremony during Dorai Broto, mother deity which is actually a is again a manifestation of Bishahori itself, of Monosha itself. Uh, but then the priest can only be an androgynous person, and in many cases, it has been found that they are also the faith healers of that particular community. But this faith healing has been now taken to the level of commodification. There are many people who possibly do not believe in Dorai, I mean, to the deity. They may not be the follower, they may not belong to this particular community. They might be urban people, but they still approach the priests, the androgynous priests for medicines. So this is what I am trying to bring to the platform. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we will move on to Professor Anway Mukhopadhyay. So, sir, you have mentioned Guptamani's Mandir and so many things. The earliest born faiths celebrate the female as a source of life, and they often consider the earth itself as a female since it gives lives to us all. And early societies greatly valued women because of their childbearing capabilities and the primal creative energy, which these societies recognized as female. And indigenous faiths do not have the preoccupation with the distant future that later religions developed. The present is the time that is important. And what do you think about this? Where such experiences are complex and intersectional, how do factors such as gender, sexual orientation, and age, or disability, or other status shape them? And this may include, but not limited to, the violence and discriminations against indigenous women, girls, and LGBT persons in the name of religion and the belief systems. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shomi, for this elaborate question. In fact, questions should be elaborate like this. So it reminds me of my student years, and I used to come up with very elaborate questions to my teachers. Actually, there are a lot of things involved here. Number one, yes, there is a reverence towards the art in almost all the indigenous communities, because there is, as Professor Datta Gupta and Dr. Majumder have also pointed out, there is a close connection between the land and the people who inhabit that land, though that is also problematic. For instance, Dr. Majumder was actually indicating the problems involved there. So if you have too many people, or rather too many communities, claiming that they are the most original and most sort of rightful inhabitants on that land, then what happens? So indigeneity is also a very problematic issue, and in fact that requires another round of telling stories, alternative stories probably. So there are alternatives and then alternatives to alternatives. But the point is that you will often find that there is a very complex approach to the feminine and to the divine feminine in the indigenous communities. For instance, the idea that all the indigenous communities worship the divine feminine or greatly value the divine feminine, this idea might actually not always be factually correct, because from my understanding of and engagements with many of the religions of such communities, what I have come to find is that there are certain indigenous religions which see the divine feminine as very important. So the divine feminine has a prominent place there. But in other some other communities, that is not the case. And secondly, here we have to think about some other issues. Since I deal with religious studies, I would again remind all of you of these intricacies. Number one, when we talk about the configuration of the divine, we need to factor in a lot of issues. For instance, I might believe in the divine feminine, but that doesn't mean necessarily that I believe in the absolute power of the divine feminine, right? So whom do you privilege in your figuration of the divine? You might privilege the male divinity and the female divinity simultaneously. You might see the male divinity as more important than the female divinity, or you might see the female divinity as more important than the male divinity. So there are all these issues involved there. For instance, if you have ancestor worship in one community, then if there is a focus on the ancestral lineage in feminine terms, then you have a focus on the the primordial mother. On the other hand, for instance, in certain parts of Assam, you have that kind of culture. In fact, the site of Kamakya is also seen as a place where the Adi Mata or the primordial mother was worshipped, and she was seen as the ultimate ancestor, female ancestor. But on the other hand, you have religions where you have a focus on the male ancestors. So the female ancestor might be important, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she is really apotheosized. So there are levels of reverence as well. So reverence is not all. So you have heterogeneity in terms of the reverential attitude and their directions as well. So how do you revere something? I mean, do you see this divine feminine as the divine? I mean, the divine? Do you see the divine feminine as an entity which is as important as the male divine? So, and Tantra foresters, you have all these ideas. So, the male divinity equal to the female divinity more important than the male divinity. Okay, am I audible and visible? I think there was some connectivity issue. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So these things are there in all these communities as well. But yes, there is an emphasis on the art, not just on the art as the land on which they live, but rather as an entity with which they are engaged in a play of what Bracha Ettinger would call co-poesis, so on the art, but rather with the art. So it's a very different kind of idea than that typical Hannah Arendtian idea that you build the world out of the art. So it's not like that. Your worlding is dependent on your co-poesis with the art. So the art assists you in building up your world. So there is that kind of an idea. Secondly, there is an emphasis on isness. I again borrow this term from Latabani and Ruth Frankenberg. Now this idea of isness is very important there, and this isness is not just about present. it's about presence, of course, but it's not just about the present. So it's not something that closes off the two temporal poles of the past and the future. For instance, the ancestor is as much there, as much present there as as the present generation. So somehow the idea, so it's not just a kind of collapse of temporality, but of course it is a collapse of linear temporality, and that is very important, because if you think about the indigenous communities, you can't think about them in terms of linear temporality. So if we think that interaction between the ancestors and the present generation and the generations to come is a linear kind of continuum, then we would be mistaken, because it's not like that. So it's isness, that isness might manifest itself through circular dimensions as well as through linear dimensions, because the linearity here is not sort of absolutely impossible. So it's not just about circular versus linear, it's not like that. And secondly, I think you had also asked me a question about the problems that might occur when you make too much of this issue of fertility and all that, especially with respect to the LGBTQ people and other. Yes, that's a very important issue, because I would again refer to the different imaginaries associated with the idea of the divine feminine. Now, if you have a multidimensional idea of the divine feminine, then that's fine. But if you are obsessed with the idea of fertility and reproductive sexuality, then that might actually lead to the marginalization of women who are not part of that system, who are not capable of bearing children. That might lead to the marginalization of LGBTQ people as well. So there are these problems as well, so it's good to sort of respect and revere the generative principle that is involved in the art. But if we see this as the as the kind of closure to the religious imagination, then that also becomes a problem. It's not just a problem with the indigenous communities. It's in fact an epistemological problem with tantra as well. For instance, if you say that the male and the female principle are equally important and that kind of stuff, then where do you place and I have actually worked on this gay tantra, for instance. How do you where do you place gay people or lesbian people within this continuum? So then of course you can do that with a different kind of reconfiguration of the masculine and the feminine. So that is always happening in the tantric continuum at the symbolic level, and that also happens in the indigenous cultures. For instance, what we need to remember here is that the idea of the masculine and the feminine is very different there from what we understand as the masculine and the feminine. Right. So it's not always the case that that the mainstream heteronormativity of, say, a European society or even the Indian society would be the same as the as heteronormativity. That might actually be different, if not wholly different, at least different to a great extent.
Thank you so much, sir. With this, we now come to the end of today's session. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submission of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstories.biz. I extend a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Ananya Gupta, Dr. Shib Majumder, Dr. Anway Mukhopadhyay, and also Dr. Prem Phyak for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.